So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Kim Cassida, who is our MSU forage agronomist, and really she's at the hub of our research for Michigan State University forages. Kim, give us an update on your research, please.
It always helps to unmute yourself before you start talking.
That's affirmative.
You think after a year of this, we'd all have it figured out. Well, it's time for my annual update of research, forage research that we're doing here in the program at MSU. And as usual, there's not nearly enough time in this segment for me to tell you about everything that we're doing. So I picked a few highlights. I did, however, put a list in here of all of the things that we're working on, not all of which I'm going to talk about today, but I just want to give you the overview of what we're currently doing. We kept busy even during the COVID shutdowns. We had to slow down a few of these projects just so that we could keep up and comply with the university restrictions. But we actually had quite a productive year. We continue with our forage and cover crop variety testing. The funding source for that is public entry fees from industry. We continue to work with reduced lignin alfalfas. Historically, our funding from that has come from Forage Genetics and also from Project Green here in the state of Michigan. I will be giving some data on that here in a minute. We have a project to look at remote sensing for forage yield quality and species composition. And that particular project was funded by the USDA Alfalfa and Forage Research Program. We also have participated in the research that Dennis was talking about of interseeding alfalfa with corn with John Grabber and his team. And we've had funding from the Dairy Forage Research Center for that, also from the Alfalfa and Forage Research Program and Project Green. And that work is ongoing. I know there were a lot of questions about it. I didn't pick that to talk about here today because Aaron Burns and I, who are collaborating with doing the Michigan portion of that work, are planning to do a full webinar on that at some soon future time where we will be presenting those results. We'll make sure that everyone here gets an announcement about that when we get it going. We are working on cover crop grazing systems. This has been funded through the Michigan Animal Agriculture Alliance grant program and through Project Green. And I'm going to be talking about that one with a little bit of data. We continue our alfalfa autotoxicity work. And we just found out 2 days ago that we had a continuation of that work was funded through the Alfalfa Checkoff program. And we also have money from Project Green for that effort. I'm going to talk a little bit about a new effort that we're looking at developing a forage grass maturity index. And then we have a new project we're working on with Grasslands Oregon to look at perennial forage cover crops for corn. This system has been already done with Kura clover and white clover, but we are thinking about looking at some other forage options that might work for that. So I want to start out today by giving you a little bit of data on our high quality alfalfa work. I'm going to be reporting specifically on some preliminary results from our Project Green study. But just to refresh your memory about what reduced lignin alfalfa is all about, and Dennis mentioned that the Dairy Forage Research Center had a big role to play in developing these varieties, which were created by GMO techniques to actually reduce the amount of lignin in the alfalfa plant. And this is important because lignin is a primary driver of the forage quality of alfalfa. So this chart showing our typical yield curve for alfalfa goes up to a peak, then will decline, while our quality, the blue line, is declining. So typically what we try and do with alfalfa management is we're trying to cut it somewhere at an optimal level for maximizing the amount of yield that we get without too much yield quality loss. With the reduced lignin Harvextra alfalfa, what you can do is delay your harvest for usually about 7 to 10 days without getting outside of that range of dairy quality forage that we want to have. Meanwhile, the alfalfa continues to grow during that time, and so you don't lose as much yield. So the new harvest date would be, maybe about a week later. And what we hope we can get from that is equal annual yield and quality in fewer harvests with better persistence. The persistence comes in because when you delay the harvest, you let that alfalfa have a little bit more time to regenerate its root in between those cuttings, because a 28-day harvest schedule is pretty tough on our alfalfa. So what have we found out? This particular study was done in 2 locations. We did it in East Lansing and up in Chatham, but due to various complications, the Chatham study is a year behind. And so I'm not going to present data from that today because it's not finished yet. But what we did was pick 6 commercial varieties, just bought them off the shelf. And we harvested them over a 3-year period every 28, 35, or 42 days. And here's our results for East Lansing showing dry matter yield. This is the total yield over those 3 production years. And the varieties that we picked is WL354HQ is just a typical conventionally bred high quality alfalfa that we know from our variety test works well here in Michigan. We have AFX 469, which is a good conventionally bred sort of typical high yield alfalfa. We included Higest 360, which is a conventionally bred variety that's in the high quality group. In other words, that means it was selected for improved quality in conventional way. And then we have 3 Harvextra varieties. These are the GMO ones. And we picked, for no particular reason, mostly because we could get seed at the time, we picked the varieties HVX Driver. We have WL341 HVX RR and an FSG variety, which I'm not going to read all the numbers of. And what we found was, not unexpectedly, our best yielding one here was the conventional WL variety. There was a little bit of yield drag on the HVX varieties when they first came out. But I think the key thing to look at here is that is declining, because when we look here at the difference between AFX 469 and the FSG variety, had the same yield statistically. When you see this B up at the top, that means statistically those 2 were the same. Now our other 3 higher quality alfalfas, including 2 of the Harvextras and the Higest, were the same as that FSG variety, but they were a little bit behind our conventional ones. So there's still a little bit of yield drag, but they're catching up. And that's actually kind of what you expect when a new variety with this kind of technology is introduced. What did our forage quality look like? If we looked at the average lignin content of all of our cuttings over all 3 years, this is just an average, we found, as we expected, that our Harvextra varieties had the least amount of lignin. A little bit to our surprise, we also found in this study that the Higest conventionally bred variety had a lignin content that was not different from the Harvextras. And all 3 of those were behind our AFX variety and equivalent to the WL one. But that's not really where the rubber meets the road. What really we want to know about is how that lignin influences the NDF digestibility of those forages. And this is shown here. And as we expected in this case, our conventionally bred WL and AFX varieties have the lowest NDF digestibility. In this case, we want the digestibility to be higher That's our good thing. Our Harv Extras, 2 of them were clearly higher than our conventionally bred ones. But again, a little bit to our surprise, we demonstrated here that not all of our Harv Extra varieties are the same. There is variability in the amount of forage quality that we are seeing in those, and you kind of expect that. And we in fact found that the FSG Harv Extra variety had equivalent neutral detergent fiber digestibility to the High-Gest. And what this basically is indicating is that varieties differ. I want to talk just a second here about what happens when you manage for that longer harvest interval. When we do the 28-day interval here in southern Michigan, we are going to fit in 5 cuttings in that scenario. But when we stretch that out to, I don't have the right numbers on here. This should be 35 and 42. My apologies. But when we stretch those numbers out, the result would be the same. You drop back to only 4 cuttings per year on the 2 longer harvest intervals. So the difference between 5 cuttings and 4 cuttings is going to affect your cost per acre to produce that forage. And when we looked at the annual dry matter yield over the 3 harvest schedules in each year, and this chart does not include the variety parts, not in here at all, because we did not find that variety interacted with harvest schedule. All of the varieties acted exactly like I'm showing right here. And what we pretty clearly find is that as we progress to the longer harvest intervals, we are seeing a trend towards more dry matter yield. And that 28-day schedule is going to give us a yield hit in every year of the study because you just don't get the same amount of regrowth in that period of time. And what this demonstrates is that when you are able to extend that, that timing, it does have advantages to yield as well as cost per acre for equipment use on the field. Not everything is great here. The pluses we see for that longer harvest intervals include improved persistence of the plant. Theoretically, now, Harv Extra has not been around long enough for us to know whether we are really going to see improved persistence, because those seeds were really only introduced on a widespread basis into the market in 2017. So nobody has any on-farm persistence data that's more than 4 years old. Remains to be seen how this helps us. But theoretically, we hope that it's going to. We have fewer weeds in the longer harvest interval, and we have the reduced harvest cost. Some of the disadvantages are you can see increased leaf drop if you have leaf diseases in the field where it's out there in the field for a longer period of time, and so those leaves fall off and you lose both quality and yield. It doesn't necessarily eliminate the chance of a weather disaster. We actually had one instance on one of our cuttings on this trial where we were going, the weather was great for the 28-day interval, but a week later when we went to do the 35-day interval, we were having crappy weather. So, where that bad weather falls, you can't always know far enough ahead of time to know where your cutting is going to be the most effective. And another thing that we have consistently found here in East Lansing at the at this site is that when we extend the harvest interval on these Harv Extra varieties, we are increasing our chance of hitting the 50% bloom point before we have our scheduled harvest. And this is important because Roundup Ready alfalfa, and all Harv Extra varieties are also Roundup Ready, are required, according to your stewardship agreement that you agreed to when you bought the seed, they are required to be harvested no later than 50% bloom. So if you're in a situation in midsummer where it is going to hit 50% bloom before your longer interval, you're still going to have to go out and cut it at the shorter interval. And that may mess up your farm schedule planning. Now, another problem here, and I think this is kind of emphasized by what we're finding in this study, because obviously the varieties are not all the same. But the problem is that public alfalfa variety tests do not report quality. I recently reviewed the few states that are still doing this, and not a single one of them is reporting quality in the last year or so. And obviously, when we are targeting variety selection mostly towards quality, this becomes a problem when we're trying to get objective data to give good information to farmers. So my question to all of you is that should our public alfalfa variety tests be reporting quality? And if that is to begin to happen, the pressure for that needs to be put on the seed companies to pay for it. And that's part of the reason we don't do it, is because it would make the variety test cost more. All right, I'm going to finish up talking about our cover crop grazing study. And this is a study we actually started several years ago. It's been a rather complicated process to get this funded. The ultimate idea for what we are trying to do with this study is take a wheat silage corn rotation, and we would go in after the wheat comes off, which here on campus is usually late July, mid to late July. We will plant a cover crop on that field, graze it with sheep in the fall, and then the following year we'd terminate whatever cover crop made it through the winter and plant our silage corn. And so our two objectives here are to compare the performance of those lambs finished on the cover crops to lambs that were finished either in a backgrounding system, which is half cover crop and half feedlot, or 100% feedlot system. And we would be looking at animal growth as well as following through to carcass quality and the flavor of the meat. Our flavor panel, our sensory panel was unfortunately delayed last spring due to COVID, but we have got that moving again, and we are now scheduled in April to conduct our sensory panel to look at the flavor of our meat. We're very excited about that. And the second part of this study is to follow through and look at soil health and corn silage performance in the following year and how that may have been influenced by grazing the cover crop or not. And I'll present a little bit of data here. So I think for these animal performance slides, I thank our graduate student, Kat Macaluso, for putting these together for a presentation she did earlier this year. What we're looking at right here is the available biomass during the grazing of the cover crops in our 2 years. We have done this in 2019 and again in 2020. And we are working to get funding to repeat it for a third year. But we've had very, very different weather in our 2 years here. Basically, we plant this in late July, and our target is to go out 8 weeks later and graze it. So this period of time here is looking from mid-October to mid-December. With the blue is the tubers or roots of our brassica crops that we were growing, and the green is the tops. So that would be the turnip tops, and also in one of our treatments, the mixed treatment, we had peas, oats, and some warm season grasses. And you can see this black line is our temperature. So you probably all remember in 2019, we had that kind of freaky cold period and about a foot of snow in early November. And that really diminished the ability of our cover crops to continue growing. You know, normally in November, I would actually expect to see it continue to increase biomass. That's what we got in 2020. You can see over here, both of our treatments, instead of peaking in the middle of our growing period, and well, they did still peak in the middle, but they peaked at a much higher rate. Let's put it that way. So we had a lot more biomass available. You'll see here that our brassica, pure brassica trial treatments did not have any more biomass available than the ones in the mixture. So we aimed for both of these mixtures to cost less than $30 per acre, but the complex mixture did cost a little bit more than the brassica, even though we kept all of those under that window. We didn't really see any difference in performance of the animals on the two treatments. I'll get to that here in a second, get ahead of myself. One thing, I don't know, I'm an agronomist. So one thing I found very interesting in the study was when we did botanical composition analysis of this complex mixture, which had 9 things in it. And what we found is when you look at the composition by species over time, so here we have it measured in week 1, week 5, and week 9 in 2019, and then the same weeks in 2020, you can see that there is a lot of variability here on the proportion of the different components that are in that mixture. So that is going to have some impact on the ability of your animals to gain weight because these components may have somewhat different forage quality, although that's not something we specifically separated out here. But if you look at the week 5 components of that complex mixture, I just want to point out here that our Berseem clover legume component was not impressive. We did have quite a lot of field pea, but in particular, when you looked at our 2 warm season grasses, our Japanese millet and our pearl millet, basically when we planted those in late July or early August, we're not seeing enough biomass production to really make me think that those are doing much good in our mix at all. We'd probably have been better off to just stick with our forb component, which is the brassicas, our legumes, and our grasses. And I'll also point out, just you see there's a sizable amount of wheat here. We did not deliberately plant wheat in these fields, but it was a wheat field. So we did have a certain amount of volunteer wheat from seed that escaped the combine that would come up. And, you know, that's perfectly good forage. So that didn't bother us. And here's the same components here in week 9. And by then, the warm season plants have been killed by frost or completely out of the picture. And we're left with the brassica and pea and oats components primarily that are making most of our forage that's available. Here's our animal data. This is a little bit of a messy slide, so let me try and walk you through it. The green bars, the dark green and the light green, are the first year. We broke our growth up into 2 periods, the first 4 weeks of grazing and the second 4 weeks of the study. The reason we did that is because the background treatment was on pasture for the first 4 weeks, and then they moved to the feedlot for the second 4 weeks. The feedlot, the grain treatment was all feedlot all the time, and the brassica and mixture treatments were all cover crop all the time. And what we found is probably one of the biggest take-home messages we found from the study over the 2 years is if you look at the 2 brassica and mixture treatments, there's really no difference between those. Both of those performed pretty much the same over both years. We see the most average daily gain in the feedlot, also not a big surprise. But the backgrounding treatment performed while it was on pasture, similar to the brassica treatment, which was the same mix that they were grazing. But when we moved those into the feedlot for that second 4 weeks, we had a huge amount of compensatory gain on those animals, and it pretty much enabled them to reach equivalent end weights as the animals that had been in the feedlot the whole time. And the key point to this is that what it shows is that just 4 weeks on a brassica cover crop is going to provide you a significant financial advantage because it doesn't cost as much to feed the animals there as it does to keep them in the feedlot the whole time. Now, our efforts to follow through on corn silage in 2020 were really completely skewered by the COVID restrictions, but we did manage to collect a little bit of data on the cover crop before things got really bad. And this shows soil hardness in our crops or in our site with different timing of grazing. And so what we did was we had an area that was excluded that we never grazed. So that's none, no grazing. And then we marked areas that were grazed either in October, November, or December over the course of that study the previous year. And then we went out there in May and with a penetrometer, we actually measured soil hardness. And we did find at the 5 centimeter soil depth, which is about 2.5 inches for those of you who think in English units. We did have a significant amount of compaction at that layer when the cover crops were grazed in November or October or November, but not in December. And those were significantly more than our no grazing treatment. So what this probably suggests is that when the ground started to get colder and freezing, we didn't have as much impact of the animals grazing as we had at the earlier periods, which were quite wet in 2019. You'll also note here that there is a significant amount of compaction down at about the 8 to 10 inch layer. This black line indicates 300 PSI of pressure on this chart. And that's the point where we really start to worry about compaction restricting root growth. And this down here has nothing to do with our grazing treatments. This is the plow pan in this field from repeated tillage activities. And my last bit of data here is looking at the effect of that fall grazing on the ability of our cover crop to overwinter, suppress weeds the following spring, and provide ground cover that help protect that soil over the winter. So when we look at the percentage of live cover crop that was left the following spring, we find that we did significantly reduce the survival of the cover crop by grazing it. Now, this could be a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe you want to use the livestock to help suppress the cover crop, in which case it would be a good thing. If you wanted to have more of it survive the winter, it would be a bad thing. We found that grazing the cover crop in October acted to increase the amount of weeds that we had present the following spring. So we're just looking at live weed cover here as percent of ground cover. But when we grazed in November or December, we weren't different from no grazing on weed cover. So again, it indicates that the timing of the grazing may be important. Grazing definitely tended to reduce the amount of residue that was present on the soil over the winter. And when we looked at the percentage of totally bare ground that we had the following spring, we had much less totally bare ground, which meant no live cover crop and no residue on it the following spring when we had removed some material by grazing. So this year, we have obtained our funding to look at the corn silage data this year. We're going to be hopefully doing the full tamale of everything that we plan to do this year and have some good results to talk to you about next year.
Kim?
Yes.
Oh, I thought that was the last data that you had.
I thought it was too. Just one more thing I just want to mention quickly, and this is a brand new study we're doing. And the idea here is to look at how forage grass maturities rank with each other. This is some data that was collected by a group of collaborators are listed over here on this side, just looking at the relative heading dates of different grasses across different sites in the United States. And you can see here for these different types of grass, as you might expect, there are ranges in maturity. And so you might say, well, so what? But what we're trying to do with this is producers are always wondering how a grass variety ranks in maturity relative to other things, because you're trying to put mixtures together with a predictable maturity. And what our group is trying to do is develop a grass maturity index. So if you took that same data that I showed in the last slide and I just ranked them from high to low by heading date, this is just day of the year over here. This starts approximately the last week of April and goes through June. You can see that the different colors, the different varieties of grass are all interlapping with each other. So what we really need to know is not which variety within a grass is got a certain maturity. What we want to know is how it ranks with everything. And the idea of this study is if we could look at approximately 7-day intervals marked by these arrows. This shows relative maturities by week. And we could pick indicator varieties that would hit each of these marks. We could potentially develop a ranking system that the grass seed industry could use to put an objective ranking on varieties to compare it to all other grass varieties for heading date. And this initiative is actually being driven by the grass breeder industry. And so we're hoping that we can get more funding to continue this and have some really useful information for all of you in a few years. I want to thank the team. Don't forget to visit our website. And now I'm really done, Phil.
All right, Kim, I do have a couple questions tied to your Harv Extra talk. And the first one is, does a 3% increase in NDFD from low lignin influence milk production? Is it enough of a difference to be relevant?
Well, that is a really good question, and I'd like to be able to answer it for you. However, we still don't have a feeding trial. We have a lot of data now about agronomists growing Harv Extra in the field and looking at how harvest schedules affect yield and quality. But the rubber doesn't meet the road until you feed it to a cow and see how she milks. And that data, if it exists, has not been made public anywhere that I have seen it. So until we have that, I can't tell you the answer to that question.
Another question tied to Harv Extra. What does the Harv Extra NDFD data look like at the much more animal relevant NDFD 30 or even NDFD 24 rather than the 48 as reported?
We reported 48 here just because that is, there's some argument here. Scientifically, people like to report 48 hours. I know that the industry is moving towards shorter times. Yes, we do have data for 30-hour actually, and it shows the same pattern. I do not have any data for the shorter interval you mentioned.
Okay. So Dennis does have a comment. He says, Ken Kalshore is in the USDFRC is conducting a research trial with reduced lignin alfalfa right now. So maybe we can get those answers in the future. So and a couple more questions on cover crops. Was there additional fertilizer used after wheat?
That particular study is in a system. That is a cropping system for a dairy farm here on campus, and their typical system is every time they change crops, they apply manure. So there was a manure application made after the wheat came off before the cover crop was grown. So it should have a pretty good nutrient level. We'll be reporting on that eventually.
Okay. Does the reduced lignin influence moisture or drying time in a hate crop?
There is a fair amount of questions about that in the industry. I've heard that question before. I know that there are a lot of growers who think that the Harv Extra, or actually it may be related to Roundup Ready in general, does not dry down as well as a conventional variety, but I have not seen any data on that one way or the other. So that's something that probably we should look at.
Kim, that was the last of our questions for now. So I'm going to say thank you very much.